I have the pleasure, of course, of having some water in a water bottle, so fortunately no need to go off in search of fresh elephant dung just yet. However, we do have a lovely surprise for you all. Thank goodness I checked just to double check how close Thandi was to that large dip that I mentioned earlier, the one where we just, no matter how hard we try, don't have signal. But the good news is she's far enough outside of that dip that we can actually bring you these beautiful images of Thandi, who could not look, twitch as I said that, who could not look more spread-eagled if she tried. Spread across the branches of this apple leaf, or at least this one branch of the apple leaf. What a perfect branch. I cannot think of a more appropriate looking leopard branch for her to be sitting in. It is just so comfortable. So for our new viewers who perhaps started watching today, you saw Karula and Hosanna and Shungile this morning on the Sunrise Safari. You also saw Shadow and her brand new little cubs that Brent was talking about earlier. This is the third member of that sort of particular triangle, if I can call it that. It is Shadow's sister Thandi and Karula's daughter. So they're from the same litter, Shadow and Thandi. They were litter mates. They are now 10 years old. 10 years old, and they basically share adjacent territories to each other. So Shadow is on one side of Karula's territory, and Thandi is on the other. And Thandi is a leopard that we actually don't get to see all that often. Fortunately, the chances of seeing her have increased now that we've expanded a little in terms of where we can drive to include a little portion of her territory, which is Chitwa. She also, somewhere, has a charming little cub, who I think must be about 5 months old now, unless I'm mistaken. You all know what I'm like with a sense of time and the passage of time, but I think he must be about 5 months old now. I don't know where he is, I don't know if he is with her, but I can tell you that I'm excited because this is one of my absolute favorite leopards to have a chance to see. I'll just bear with me one sec, I just want to chat to Mike very quickly. Now you keep looking at Thandi and I'll chat to Mike. How's it? Never mind. I won't do that. Bye! The reason he is rushing off is because he's on his way to my next surprise. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We're not jumping just yet. So Thandi, the lovely Thandi that's on the back of my vehicle, sorry, that sun is so bright, just look straight into it. The lovely Thandi that's on the back of my vehicle has now seen 7 different leopards, including 2 brand new cubs seen for the very first time on our live safaris. It's not a bad way to spend a day, huh? Definitely not. So there we go, number 7, gorgeous Thandi, who at the moment is doing a very good job of hiding her face from us. I don't know why she chose to settle there. I mean, I know it's nice to lie in trees, and it does on hot days like today. You'll often find leopards spread-eagled across a branch, just because it gives them a bit of extra shade and also gets them away from the ticks, and provides a little bit more in the way of a breeze to help to cool them down. But she's managed to put herself right in the sun, which seems like a silly spot to be in. So I'm not sure where her little boy is. I haven't seen him in about a month, and I'm still dying to have a proper sighting with him, actually spend time with him, because really when compared to Karula's cubs, we don't know much about him at all. We just had to make do with pictures from other people who've had a chance to see them. So I always get very, very excited when I hear Thandi called in, and I always generally go racing off to go and see her. But this unfortunately is as close as I can get, given that she is on Torchwood at the moment, as are my front wheels a little bit, not quite. Just off the road. The sweet history said it looks as though it must hurt to lie like that. Absolutely, it looks as though it must hurt. But leopards have this marvelous way of, I don't know, somehow looking comfortable, or somehow making themselves comfortable and falling deeply asleep in the most unpleasant looking positions. We've seen every one of our leopard characters do it in the past. The way that they bunch up their feet, curl up, tuck themselves under. They generally have just a weird look about them in the way that they lie. And I can promise you now, that is uncomfortable. I know because I've tried it. I have tried to drape myself across the boughs. Oh my goodness, I'm sorry, it's so bright. I've tried to drape myself across the boughs of a tree, and it's not as comfortable as they make it look. It is absolutely not. It is genuinely unpleasant. Like this bright sun, and unfortunately this is the only position I can adopt, I'm afraid. I can't really shift around too much, otherwise we won't be able to see much of her. Hey, sleepy girl. Thank you for not disappearing before we had a chance to see you. She definitely doesn't look as though she's got much planned. Just a little bit of a background on one of the most recent times that I last saw Thandi. She is quite the opportunistic hunter. They all leopards are, but I was just thinking back to that now much repeated baboon sighting that we had with Thandi, where she saved her 2 cubs from the baboons. But I was just thinking about the fact that at that particular moment in time she had 3 adult impala kills. So never be fooled by a sleeping leopard. And I'm sure she caught one of those impala, was resting, and the other 2 just happened to be hapless victims that wandered in, and she caught like a true opportunistic leopard. So never underestimate a sleeping leopard, because they can go from sleeping to hunting in a heartbeat. They seldom do, though, when we're watching them. And Bertus, you want to know if Shadow and Thandi will be aggressive towards each other. Most likely not. Generally, the related females are aware that they are related to some extent. I'm going to preface this answer by saying leopards are weird. They do odd things and unexpected things and unpredictable things at times. I mean, all animals out here can be unpredictable. We certainly don't claim to know everything there is to know about them, and I think we're discovering new things all the time. Generally, though, well, I've used that word a lot. It's apparently becoming my new favorite word. It's my new incredible. Generally, leopards females that are related to each other they're not affectionate with each other, but they generally don't fight. So they will growl, there'll be a lot of posturing. We've seen it with Karula and Shadow, and I mean, that's a mother-daughter combination. So that's about as tight a bond as these leopards will ever form. So we've seen Karula blowing spit bubbles at her daughter Shadow, and growling at her a few times in the past. We've seen Thandi mating with Tingana in Karula's territory, and again, a little bit of growling happening. And you'll probably find that Thandi and Shadow, were they to encounter each other, although one of them would have to be really out of their normal path, but they'd probably growl, blow bubbles, salivate a great deal, and then move on with their lives. And that's how most conflict is resolved in the leopard world. Lots of posturing, a bit of positioning from side to side, and then done. That's it. Very seldom ends up in physical confrontation. An unrelated female leopard, though, is a different story. And there's a good chance in those situations that those 2 leopards will come into conflict with each other, and they will fight each other. Well, what an amazing day. Shadow, Karula, and Thandi all in one day for us. That's quite special. Now, we've spoken a lot about the fact that it's very common to see females in the vicinity of their mother's territory, even adult females, and that's very, very clearly borne out with Shadow, Thandi, and Karula. Thandi on one side, Karula on the other, and Shadow on the other side. With Karula in the middle. So it's a really, really clear example of the way in which female offspring often stay within the area of their mothers. And we have a question about whether or not, or how it all works. How does a female cub come to adopt a part of her mother's territory? And I think it happens in a very gradual process, and I'm pretty sure I've got this name wrong, so let me just double check with Kirsty. Sweet history. I, for some reason, heard street history, which didn't sound exactly right. Apologies, Sweet History. Sweet History, it's quite a complex process, quite a gradual process, I think. I think you'll probably find that it's where that female cub feels the most secure in its mother's territory, so a place perhaps that it's most familiar with, although they will go wandering and they will seek out different spots, often then marking on top of their mother's scent marking, and gradually getting to the point where they have established their own little corner. And bear in mind that territories are fluid. It's not a set boundary thing. So it will change constantly on a weekly or a monthly basis, and will also depend not just on the mother's reaction, but also the other leopards around this area. So, for example, there is a vacuum at the moment, as far as we know. It might have been filled, but there's a vacuum, or there was a vacuum, just to the north of Karula's territory, where an old leopard, not an old leopard, but an older leopard called Shaluva used to live. And Shaluva was killed by the dominant male in this area, which meant there must have been a vacuum left in her territory. So if Shungita had been a little bit older, perhaps that would have been the place that she would immediately have established herself. Next door to her mom, some familiar places, and at the same time not having to worry too much about encroaching or meeting up with her mother. Because it seems to me that leopards, once they've left their mothers, have a very solitary nature. Even when they come together to mate, unless they have cubs, they don't really relish being in the company of any other leopards. Even when they mate, they seem to resent each other's company. And Thandi in particular, when we've seen her mating with Tingana, she gets very cross. She's given him a fair few smacks. One of my favorite things about her, because she's such a tiny little leopard. I don't know if she just seems tinier to me just because of the sightings that I've had with her, but I think I'm not sure if she's just not slightly smaller than her mother. Maybe there's just something in her body language that makes her look smaller. Preet, that's really lovely to hear. You want to know what does Thandi mean. I'm sorry, I can't actually look into the camera anymore. Preet, you want to know, you say that in Hindi, Thandi means cold. That's fascinating. That is really, really amazing. Thandi, what does your name mean?
It means somebody who's loved.
Somebody who's loved. So it's exactly the same as here. Thandi means out here in the local language, it means the loved one, or somebody who is loved a lot. So there you go. She's definitely not very cold. Definitely not very cold at all. Not that it's that uncommon to name leopards after rain or after weather. Mvula, for example, it means rain. So there you go. Thandi means the one who is loved. That's fascinating. Is it spelt the same way? Thandi in Hindi. I'd be curious to know. Useful to remember that. Sorry, Kirsty, there was several conversations that happened there at once. Was that a negative? Oh, apparently it's spelt, oh no, it's spelt exactly the same. So there you go. Thandi, your name means that you are very loved, or potentially that you're also very cold. She definitely doesn't look as though she's very cold, though. She looks as though she's very comfortable, but not very cold. She's definitely not showing any signs of moving. I'm just wondering whether I'm tossing up. My other surprise is on the boundary as well. So I'm just trying to decide whether or not I should leave Thandi for now and go and have a look at my other surprise, or if I should stay with Thandi a little bit longer. We haven't even seen her face, which is unfortunate. She hasn't even turned towards us. So I feel a little bit like we shouldn't leave until she at least shows us her face, but she doesn't seem to want to. Hey girl. Such a lovely, comfortable spot. I wonder if we shouldn't go tossing up. What do you think? Let me put it to you, all of you. Should we stay or should we go in the true spirit of the clash? Should we stay or should we go? Please send through your answers. Hashtag Safari Live on Twitter. I'm just going to do this. I know I shouldn't. I know I'm going to get into trouble for it. But hashtag Safari Live on Twitter, or email through to questions@wildearth.tv. And you can let me know whether you want to stay a bit longer or leave. While you decide, let's go across to Steph, who's doing a good thing on this hot afternoon and visiting waterholes. Thandi in a tree, and it's all been go, go, go. Finally, we have a chance to see Thandi's lovely face. Hello, girl. You've swapped your position around, facing the opposite direction now, but still feet dangling and not showing any signs of shifting around. There's that face that I personally see quite strongly in Shungile. And sometimes when Shungile looks at us, she just looks so similar to Thandi. Oh, we might have timed this really well. She looks as though she's up. Unfortunately, she's looking in the wrong direction. Thandi, come this way, girl. Beautifully posed. So similar and yet different to her sister. I know that Brent has been discussing hunting during the full moon. I was just wondering whether or not predators have their noses out of joint when it is full moon, because of course it becomes slightly more difficult for them. But then leopards hunt during the day as well, so there's no reason why a full moon should totally disadvantage them. It just makes life ever so slightly more difficult. And the wind is still blowing, which of course will work in her favor as she heads off into the night. There's no rest for weary leopard mothers. Sometimes even when they're empty-bellied, a male leopard will casually lie down and spend a 24-hour period in one spot. But our mothers of young cubs, don't really have that luxury. From Karula, Shadow and Thandi, all three of them have to keep themselves moving, constantly looking to keep their little ones fed. So she knows that soon she must get up and go off in search of something to feed on. I wonder where her little cub is. She does have a tendency to keep it to the south of where we are now, on Chitwa. Last time I heard, he was hiding underneath the lodge, one of the lodge rooms, which is where he was born, apparently. She denned underneath one of the rooms of the lodge, or the decks of the lodge, which Karula's been known to do as well, apparently. These leopards become so comfortable in our presence, or in the presence of human beings, that sometimes they even utilize lodges as den sites. Listening intently. Arbeard, absolutely, you are correct. There are less ticks and less flies up in a tree just like that. And that's one of the other reasons why at this time of year you so often find them draped in marula trees. And I mean, if you look back on the sightings that we've had, if you were to go and do some statistical analysis, which doesn't sound very exciting, of the sightings that we've had of leopards in trees versus leopards on the ground, I'm sure you'd find a far higher percentage during this time of year. Extra shade, a nice cool breeze, and you are correct. An absence of flies and ticks, which could only be considered to be an advantage, and something that I sympathize with tremendously. It's one of the big reasons why lions in certain parts of the world, or certain parts of Africa, have also not mastered to the same degree leopards have, but do spend a lot more time in trees than ours would, because there are areas where there are tsetse flies, and by climbing up into the trees it helps them to escape from those biting insects. So yes, absolutely, there's a definite connection between the two. Obviously the flies, you can see from her twitching ears, obviously the flies still make it up there, but it's not quite as bad. Big yawn, always a prelude with big cats to movement. A couple of big yawns and a couple of paw licks, and you know that the animal that you're watching is about to start on their way. Much like us when we try to get out of bed at 4:30 in the morning, as Brent I'm sure was describing. I don't lick my paws though, I do yawn a few times. Or alternately, a prelude to turning round and lying down in the opposite direction. One or the other. And back to the pose that she started in at the beginning of the sunset safari. Draped across the apple leaf. I guess she decided 5 more minutes, and then she'll get up. Just 5 more minutes before it's time to go out hunting. Definitely very relaxed in her apple leaf. It's a good spot. It's a very good spot. She likes this main road a lot. I think that's actually biased, isn't it? I was going to say most of my sightings of Thandi have been on this main road, but seeing as we could only traverse this main road at one point, it was the only part that went through her territory, so of course we only saw her on this main road. That's not quite accurate. No, Fly. Stop it. Perhaps I should go and climb into the tree with her. Definitely not with Thandi. She is most definitely a leopard that is not afraid to show her feelings. That tail acting as the perfect heavy balance, and it is heavy. Having had the opportunity to feel a leopard's tail before, it is very, very weighty, which makes it the perfect balancing tool, counterbalance. Okay, Thandi. Now, I don't know if her cub is here or not, so as it does start to get a little bit darker, and especially with her proximity to the hyena den, I'm probably going to leave her be. Just because now it's getting a little bit dark, the hyenas are going to start moving around again, and for all I know, her cub could be in the bushes somewhere down there. I think what we'll do now, glancing over her shoulder, what we'll do now is we will leave her be. Let her decide whether or not she's going to climb out of that branch or not. We've got a few more minutes though. It's still light enough to spend a little bit longer with her. Very happy looking cat. Sorry, while you're looking at Thandi, I'm just trying to remove the fly that just flew into my eye. Ouch. Max says, oh, the joys of watching a relaxed cat. A very peaceful experience, isn't it? And of course you've got the added advantage, it's a strange thing with flat cats, because 90% of the time, that's what they do. When we're sitting with them, they're flat, sleeping, dozing, but there's that 10% of flat cat sightings where all of a sudden something happens, whether it is the sudden emergence of a different predator, a lion or wild dog or another leopard, and all of a sudden the game changes completely. And in my experience, while we've been sitting with any of our predators that have been flat, those sorts of moments happen in a heartbeat. We've had hyenas and wild dogs, we've had that one incredible sighting with Karula, then it was Tingana and Shadow that arrived, and then it was the hyena, and then it was the wild dog. Flies biting me. We've had Karula and the wild dogs before, we've had leopard and lion before, so things do tend to change in the blink of an eye. I think though it's starting to get a little bit dark. I just want to scan quickly. I don't think her cub is here, but I just want to scan quickly just to check and see if there's any eyes blinking back at me. Doesn't look like it. Hard to tell. I mean, if a baby elephant disappears into the long grass, you can just imagine that a tiny leopard would essentially vanish. Yeah. No sign of the little cub, and no indication that Thandi wants to move either. Apologies. Just try and recover my eyeball in tears now that the fly has taken them all. Jason, with cubs, of course, we're always very, very careful about the way in which we treat the sightings. You would have seen that with James and Shadow's cubs. Jason, by a month old, the cubs have started to practice climbing. By 2 months old, they are competent enough at climbing that's when we start to feel comfortable with visiting them or with seeing them. So between the sort of 1 to 2 month age gap is where they really start to get quite good at it. And whenever we saw, for example, Karula's cubs at that age, they were so often hidden as just tiny little spotty balls in the thin branches of trees. So by 2 months they're adequate climbers, which is essential. You can imagine that for something that tiny and vulnerable, that doesn't live in a den site all the time, so it doesn't live in something like a hyena den, doesn't have the protection of the pack or a social structure like a lion, or indeed the size and the strength of a lion, you can imagine that it's absolutely essential to those cubs' survival that they are able to climb as soon as they possibly can. Because that basically takes any predator out of the equation. Then the only threat to them when they're at the top of a tree, provided they can get there and they're not taken by surprise, is a baboon. That's when baboons really become a threat to little leopard cubs. But other than that, it puts them out of the reach of all sorts of things. And also is at the point in their lives at around between 6 weeks to 8 weeks old, they've started to become a lot more aware of their surroundings. In the beginning they're like puppies or kittens. They're kind of a bit oblivious to anything outside a very small radius, but once they get a bit older, then you start to see them recognizing larger things and stuff outside of their immediate personal space, which is essential as well. Okay, girl, I think I'm going to leave her now. It is quite dark and I don't know whether or not the cub is there, so we're going to move off. But before we do, just time for us to say a quick farewell before we begin the long journey home. So thank you to Craig and thank you to all of you for joining us. I hope you've had a marvelous time and enjoy your last few minutes with Brent.